Welcome to our Cultural Talk Story series. My name is Jose Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Today's event will focus on toward a reconnection with the Irish gender identity with BREE-uhn and Ruadhán. Thank you for joining us today to sit down at our table to learn about Indigenous nations near and far. Our co-sponsors today are the Language Hunters, Let's Learn Irish, and Inquiry. And our today's conversation will be about gender in the Irish language viewed through a framework of decolonization. We admit that the limitations in research of source materials and of current working theories lead to many unknowns. Duality, liminality, triplicity, and trans-istionary shape shifting are plentiful in native vernacular literature. But we wonder how much of and to what extent that literature has been filtered through the lens of Christianity, colonization, and modernity. We're going to start today's event by introducing our special guests. One of our initial guests is Ruadhán, who is an applied linguist, healer, and educator with major focuses on lotus, mind-body connection, and differentiated learning. They is the host of Inquiry, a podcast where they speak with graduate students about queer experiences. They are currently exploring trans identities through the academic discourse. And I also have to give a little plug as one of our alumni of our grad certificate in conflict resolution. It is really wonderful to have you back with us. Also joining us is BREE-uhn, who is the creative director of Language Hunters, an organization focused on developing play-based techniques for facilitating language learning with minority language communities. BREE-uhn is also an acclaimed singer, musician, and dancer with a particular interest in traditional singing in the Irish language. Their most recent work has focused on facilitating explorations of decolonization through the framework of Irish cultural reconnections with an organization called Grounded Connections. BREE-uhn teaches Irish for the Portland Community College and also is heading up the Let's Learn Irish, which is an online Irish learning community. To get it started, I'm going to turn it over to Ruadhán. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jose. Thank you for the introduction. Everyone, thank you for coming today, and happy St. Patrick's Day, of course. I would like to start by taking a moment of silence for those who have gone through the veil before us. Alrighty, so let us get started. Just so you all understand a little better where I am at, what I'm doing this semester is trying to look for some groundwork to kind of understand gender in a non-binary sense within my Irish diasporic identity. So I'm not native to the island, but I do have some history with Ireland. So I'm looking for something, if you guys are in the islands, you might understand this idea of a third gender in the sense of mahu here in Hawaii. And I think personally, I can't accept that as my own identifier. However, I'm sure there might be something in Irish. So this is really me looking toward all the tools that we might have, all the connections we might have to understanding gender outside of or before Christianity. So do you guys know about pronouns? Those are pretty cool. Not all pronouns, not all languages have male and female third person singular pronouns. For example, in Indonesian, if I'm referring to BREE-uhn or Jose or my friend Stephanie, they're all referred to as dia. It's not he or she. So that's kind of, there's many languages who utilize this. English is not one of them. Irish is also not one of them. So looking towards some other things that are happening recently, you guys might not be familiar maybe with Spanish. There's the él and the ella, but also there's this additional third singular pronoun that has started to come to the fore. And this is great. And it's also difficult for language speakers who have never utilized a third gender. So we see other examples like in Swedish, Hebrew, and I was lucky enough to start learning Irish, and there is this third singular pronoun. BREE-uhn, do you know the history behind this? I only saw it coming out in 2018 in that dictionary, the LGBTQ Irish dictionary.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that the impetus for the creation of that dictionary and the work that went into it beforehand helped to develop common usage using that third person plural as also third person singular, but not for non-binary or ambiguous.
And you've had some success, at least in classes I've sat in on, of utilizing this with your students?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started teaching, the idea of using the third person plural for our non-binary students was not really at the front of my mind. You know, in juggling all that teaching a foreign language, especially a minority language, requires, it wasn't really. I mean, it's obvious to me now, but at the time it wasn't. And in realizing that my community was becoming more and more diverse, especially as Irish language learning becomes more and more popular, I started to realize that there's a good portion of my community, of the Irish language community, that doesn't fit under a binary kind of understanding of she or she, but rather she. And so I made it a point to kind of change not change, but to include in my intro courses where we really just discuss first, second, third person singulars at an introductory level, to include that third person plural that's being used now to identify non-binary or ambiguous gender.
And this is very similar to the practice of using they in English, because the big thing I run into using they for my singular identity is, oh, that's a plural pronoun, you can't be using it that way. Is there pushback from the community, or because you're a teacher, you kind of get to tell people what to do?
Yeah, I've never received blowback from it, but I am fairly outspoken when I introduce it and the importance of it, and also sharing both he and they pronouns. I think maybe just being so kind of forward and frank and candid about my views has limited other people who might, in other circumstances, might give pushback. But I've not received any. If anything, I've received a lot of some humbling praise from people who've told me on the side, like, I really appreciate you including this. It's important, you know, either for them or for members of their family who identifies non-binary.
Excellent. It's a similar experience for me, but of course, these were in your classes. So very supportive students. So I'm based here in Hawaii, and I have been thinking about decolonization in a lot of different ways. And BREE-uhn and I have talked a lot about decolonization of Irish and how that, you know, the interplaying factors. Now, there are multiple different places, different historical practices that utilize more than one gender. They're essentially non-binary in nature. The first example, the Bugis people in Sulawesi, an island in Indonesia, have 5 genders. Of course, cis male and female, but also this idea of trans, male and female, and then a non-binary, or maybe both. This is Bisu. And there's some religious overlap here that we don't have time to get into, but very interesting, very exciting for me to find 5 genders in society. People who are familiar with Hawaiian tradition, essentially, inherently a non-binary community because it's tertiary. And some other examples like Samoan and Tongan as well, who have a later colonization point than Ireland did, or maybe no colonization point at all besides modernity or globalization. To my knowledge, Hawaii, Irish does not have this at the current moment. What we have use of is the third person singular and not a gendered category for people who aren't fully male, fully female, or even transitioning. Is that, Brian, do you have something to say for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that given the long, I mean, Irish as being a gendered language, um, it's tricky when we discuss like what does that mean, you know, because Irish obviously has gender in its language, but it's grammatical gender and it has quite a difficult like casing system, declension system as well. So it, without like a really deep understanding of why that is, or where it came from, knowing that it probably came in from the Latin and the introduction of writing systems that were brought in by religious organizations or religious orders, it's hard to know. But what we do know for a fact is that we've coming up to Middle Irish, there was a neuter gender. So there was the in terms of grammatical gender, and whether that applied to people is not really known. And so I feel like the term, our pronoun she, shead, really reflect on fairly limited scope of gender identity, either, you know, masc, femme, or non. So it's there's not much there with us to work with which to work, honestly. And that's a little disappointing. But at the same time, Irish has, you know, Irish is going through such a vast amount of revitalization over the last, like every 10 years, there's like more and more that I'm kind of excited to see where that might go in the future, especially as younger learners of Irish who work to a level of fluency and start using Irish within community and through social media, and will start to develop even more encompassing ideas of gender in the language that they create. Right now, we're fairly limited, and we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about An Folklore Atach, which is the queer dictionary. But so much, I think, of what we find in the Irish language is a concept that was kind of, that's maybe shared with English because of such long contact through colonization.
Mm.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, let's talk about this dictionary. This came out in 2018. Correct me if I'm wrong. And this is, I was very excited about it. However, I think it's clear in these examples that I have pulled that the English term has informed the Irish term. It's not that we went back in history to look for words like lesbian or queer. It was more an Irishization of the Anglo term. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I find extremely interesting, and I think it speaks towards inclusion of all people and the maybe willingness to share Irish with North American populations, no matter what their heritage is. But this inclusion of the term two-spirit that is reserved for Native North American populations. I find it so interesting that it's in An Folklore because Irish people are not native to North America. I'm glad this dictionary exists. You guys can find it here. I'll move it so maybe you can see. There it is. That's the full title. Are there hopes you have for this like beyond what we just talked about with the younger generations being more online, the younger generations being more involved in Irish and maybe developing something new or more Irish? Do you have other hopes for the queer community here?
I do. I mean, you know, one of the when discussing Irish language, like it's pretty important to understand that we've got two not completely separate communities of speakers, but they certainly encompass different spaces and geographies. And one is, you know, native speakers who are raised in rural communities on the western seaboard within the communities called the Gaeltacht, who are raised through the medium of Irish, as opposed to those who might become fluent through Irish medium schools called Gael Scolanna. But, you know, like, there's a bit of a maybe a disconnect between these two communities for reasons not, I mean, some reasons like well known, other reasons not fully known. But I think when it comes to how this will develop in the future. Certainly, the openness of urban communities and open education have allowed for discord around and discussions around identity, and that young people in particular are needing more language to identify themselves through their language. And so as more and more young urban speakers kind of require this language to identify themselves, I kind of see continuing development of this. And I mean, the opening remarks of the Folklore Atak, which is this dictionary that we've been talking about, really does say it's not perfect. It's a groundwork for us to start, and we realized that we needed more terminology to identify ourselves. So that is a step definitely in the right direction. What's a little disappointing what's a little disappointing from my perspective, being someone who's really identifies and learn Irish through immersion within the native speaking communities of the Gaeltacht, is that there didn't seem to be much input from the native speaking populations. And that could change over time, especially as rural communities generally are more socially conservative, kind of across the board. And that there are many reasons for that. But as it is more and more accepted and supported within those rural Irish-speaking communities, perhaps there will be kind of a bridging of what we find here within An Folklore Atak, and then what queer folks living in the Gaeltacht communities might pull out from their community members as well. That's my hope.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a bridging kind of the two.
Mm-hmm. And like uniting the people who are raised L1 first language Irish and those people in Ireland or even in North America, anyone in the diaspora, trying to come together to make, language that functions for our needs in this modern era. Now, I know Irish, we talked about this a little before, is like the language itself is governed by the state.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the the struggle when we talk about Irish has never died, right? It never died out.
Mm-hmm.
In its use. It's always been maintained within communities. I mean, Ireland was, the majority of it was Irish speaking through the 20th century. Only kind of during the famine of the mid 19th century did there start to be like a huge decline through immigration, death, and just kind of trauma from such a huge loss of population at the time. Ireland's only recently recovered that population, which is kind of staggering to think about. But the Irish language was used by cultural nationalists leading up to the independence movement as a sense and a center of identity. But those cultural nationalists were not, they did not represent the vast majority of native Irish speakers. They did very much represent kind of the aristocracy, the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. And so there was using it as a leverage in some ways. And that's kind of continued as Ireland gained independence and started opening or creating subsets of government to govern certain aspects of education, schooling. And Irish was hoped to have been revitalized during independence. And so a lot of effort was put into standardizing it and supporting it in the schooling system. However, those schooling systems were the same systems that the British colonizers had set up. And so it continued to erode, in many ways, the viability of the language. And there wasn't enough shift and change within society to support the language. And so it's really only been, I'd say the technology boom has been the bump in learning and in increasing speakers that previously was never done through just board teaching, classroom, compulsory education. But the Irish state definitely does control it. Angum and Force Nagoiga, they created a standard, not Force Nagoiga, but Angum created a standard along with certain other language officers within the Irish state to create a written standard, which was hoped to have created a kind of a flashpoint for learners to learn Irish in such a way that they could be understood by everyone. But what that did was it kind of ignored the fact that there were various dialects of Irish spoken within native communities. And so a lot of people who are learning from within the schooling system were not necessarily learning kind of vernacular Irish. They were learning a new standardized book Irish, which was somewhat strange to native speakers. And so it created a bit of a gulf. And I think as we continue to support the Irish language, there's always this give and take between native communities and the socioeconomic issues that face those communities, because they are in very rural, isolated, not arable areas where having access to education, medical care, income is difficult. And those who live in very urban communities who've learned it through education and maybe see it a lot more within social media platforms within places like Dublin, Belfast. So yeah, there is that control or wrestling of control from state sanctioned education and standardization of language, and those within rural communities who have used the language, its unbroken tradition, who've used it and aren't necessarily maybe their talents aren't necessarily always utilized as they should be in the creation of something like Untitled Chapter.
That answers my next question, that this dictionary is supported by the standardized state, or I was under the impression that it was a student project.
Yeah, it's definitely a student project, and not one that's unrecognized or was run through the state.
Okay.
It was through the Union of Students in Ireland, Aontas na Maclean, the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, and Belong To, which are three, organizations that kind of intersect in their interest in supporting queer community. And so Líochach ní Coistelle was the chair or vice chair of the Aontas na Maclean group, and they worked hard to launch this project alongside with the Transgender Equality Network of Ireland and the Belong To. And so what they recognize is that it was kind of a grassroots effort with support from other organizations that weren't necessarily just focused solely on the Irish language. And so without the support of the state, obviously there's some funding issues in terms of limitations that might have happened. But certainly, as Líochach herself kind of mentioned, it's a starting point for a larger project of like reclaiming or uncovering language as it pertains to the LGBTQ community and trans non-binary folk as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's where I'm at this semester as well, in trying to write this paper and trying to find all of the little threads that there might be and weave something or start to get into an idea of what is a third or a fourth or a beyond gender in Irish, just for my own sake, to have some sort of identifiable connection. And there is no answer. I think I have looked, and I will have to keep looking. That on folklore seems very similar, right? It's a starting point, and I'm glad it was here for me to learn from and for me to look into. And as I'm learning Irish, there are words then to describe my identity or others of my friends' identities if I'm trying to talk about queer community in a language I'm trying to acquire, because we know that our own identity is so defined by the languages that we speak. And you might become a different person or a new-ish person through a new language.
For sure. Yeah, and I mean, if we look at Unfolklore, which is the dictionary we've been talking about here, there is kind of a mixture of roots for the words that we're using. Obviously, a lot of them we use in English as well. So it might be a little bit of a misnomer to say that we've just adopted them from the English, but we did. But those words in English were also adopted from Latin and Greek roots as well. So with then some more kind of creative wording to adapt Irish to ideas like two-spirited or questioning, right? Or queer even, because even within the Gaelic dictionary for gay is éireach, and that has that double meaning as well in English, to be gay, light, airy, happy, right? So the application of that is I can see where that would be problematic as well, because is that really a concept that the Irish language identifies with gay people? Is it this gay airiness, because the term éireach does pull from that same kind of meaning. And so these are the tricky things, and looking at vocabulary and being like, oh, that's fairly standard, and that's like, oh, that's actually directly translated. And some that are a little bit more like, oh, well, that's an interesting use of roots, from our classical languages to create an identity very similar. And of course, things like pansexual, pangnéiseach, uses both a root from our classical languages, and then gnéiseach, which is the native Irish word for sexuality or gender.
I see. Well, in all languages that are working on reclamation and keeping up with things like technology, utilize or run into this issue of like, how much are we directly translating, and how much are we creating new words, and how much are we borrowing the word like email so people recognize what that means, because this technology wasn't even around before. Not to say queers were not around before we started writing language, but I
think it's with our development in English of language to better understand ourselves, we saw a proliferation of identities. And that's not to undermine that queer people didn't exist before these identities, right? But it's to say that to what extent could they talk about themselves and understand themselves without the language to do so? And that's one of the things I think in offering this dictionary was an immediate in for folks who have a developed sense of identity, who can look to some of these terms to discuss themselves within the Irish language. I don't want to downplay like that's not of importance. Obviously, it's really, really important. But in terms of decolonization, when we look at attempts to revitalize language, how much of the revitalization is done at the detriment of the language, the target language that we're working on, right? So how much am I worried about Irish becoming kind of watered down? Well, I shouldn't say watered down, but inundated with words that are rooted in English language concepts, especially if what we understand decolonization to be is not just a physical but a mental process as well. And how does that impact us when the words that we use still come from an identity that's rooted in Western subjectivity and in the English language?
Yes. That kind of brings me to my next point of these ideas, like indigenous ideas, even if we don't have control of our native tongue, right? Even though I don't have control of Irish within my own body at the moment, ideas have been translated into English about liminality, about transitionary states, right? The shape shifting is so paramount in vernacular literature, not just in Irish, but other native practices as well. And I find it to be comforting that this idea, like, it's not, there are two set ways of being. There are multiple ways of being, and it's not just reserved for the gods. Sometimes some of the stories, right, it's powerful beings who can do this, but I think, for example, like Selkies, those are normal beings who can transition their state.
Yeah, I think in relation to the vernacular literature of Irish has some of the oldest vernacular literature in Europe. It's really important to look at them, look at this literature, and just see the diversity of forms, human forms, and what they can take. Be they non-human people or human people, in the transitions that they go through in a lot of the shape-shifting that we find in our literature. And that's, I think it points to, it's a point to take when we think about, well, how would we turn around and look at our past and try to pull an understanding of different identities from it? And I think this is a good point, and it's also one that, looking back at our vernacular literature, seeing some of the parallels with identity and transitioning, having liminal states, having triplicity beyond, like the goddess tradition in Ireland generally has goddesses appear in triplicity, and so like this is really interesting, and that they represent different stages of life. And I think it's a really inspiring topic, and it's inspiring when you see that kind of liminality in the vernacular literature, because it does hearken to the fact that there likely was, while these did relate to supernatural beings, that these concepts probably also really applied to the human body and the human form. And so that's why I think it's really interesting as well when we look outside of the Irish tradition at other cultures that have not just a binary or tertiary of identities, but like a huge spectrum of identities. That to me, that's like, oh well, that gives me an idea of where to look, what types of words to look for, or where they're found, like within their own culture, and how they perceive their own identities, and how much of that is related to some Western standards that we have about gender and sexuality and things like that. So I'm really inspired to see other cultures and the diversity of gender identities that they have, and the diversity of pronouns and stuff. And I would love to be able to find that in Irish. Unfortunately, that kind of work hasn't been done yet, but because there is kind of there's a very strong queer Irish speaking community mostly situated in urban Ireland. But when those folks start to ask these similar questions, being someone of diaspora who has an understanding of my identity based on my growing up here in North America, it's not the same. It's not gonna be the same. So I'm kind of waiting to see what happens in Ireland when queer folks who are Irish speakers who identify through the language very much start to ask the bigger questions, like, well, what about our history, rather than like, what are we pulling from pop culture? What is everyone else, in pop culture talking about when they're talking about queers and gays and lesbians and this and that, non-binary folk? What could when will it be enough? Will this dictionary be enough to keep them satisfied? Or as the language continues to develop and more queer people kind of live through the medium of the Irish language, will these questions really spark kind of a renaissance in academic work to figure out from our vernacular literature and from our vernacular sources, like what language is there to really identify us outside of the Western subjective model of, masc, femme, or non-binary for that matter, to create a tertiary, And it's clear that we're getting close with just the watershed event of seeing so many queer people identify through the language. And that's interesting in and of itself, because the language is queer. As a minority language, as a strange language, as a very old language, it has that other aspect of maybe not gender identity, but this liminal thing that is beautiful, shocking, scary, welcoming. It has all the feels with it that you would expect from a heritage language and a minority language.
I also, because my access to things is often pop culture first, and then I go back and try to find the original Irish story or the translation of a story. I, for a long time, thought Selkies were inherently feminine. For example, Tom Moore's Song of the Sea, right? It's the mom and the little girl. But then I was listening to this song by Heather Dale, who's a Canadian artist, and she sings The Maiden and the Selkie. And the Selkie is a man. Like when this person transitions from seal form into human, they get married in a very hetero relationship. But it kind of queered this idea that I had of Selkie often being a feminine form to being, oh, perhaps it's masculine, or perhaps Selkie itself is an identity and people get to choose when they're coming back to human form what they would like to show to the world, which is a very trans idea, right? We get to choose what we show to the world.
Well, and that's a very good point. I mean, a lot of the folklore around the Selkie, and for those who don't know, a Selkie is basically a seal person. So they are in the sea when their mantle is on. They are a non-human person in seal form, and then when they remove their cloak or their mantle, when they're out of water, they take on the shape of a human person. And a lot of the stories that I, like there's a couple songs that I know, and certainly the stories, they tend to be femme. They are mothers who have had their cloak stolen by a male or a man, and have been kind of held prisoner. And so there's a little darker kind of and interesting parallels as well, if you want to think about trans identity and like being controlled and subjugated and having one's manifestation like removed, right? And that's what happens like in The Secret of Ruadhán, right? And any story that I've heard from the Irish tradition about a mother, Silky, who's had children by a human and had to leave her children behind, or to take her children with her into the ocean, it is beautiful that transitionary state. And just like we had mentioned before, it parallels, we get the feels when we hear those stories, because we see ourselves in the queerness and the liminality of that. I think when we it's just more inspiration to say that while we might not have the language for it, we have these stories that embody liminality and change and fluid movement between worlds and between forms. And I think that that's probably one of the most beautiful things about the understanding of the Silky tradition.
Absolutely. I had Bear on here first, for example, the pop culture reference of Brave, the movie. And I removed it because it's set in Scotland, but Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Cornish all tend to share this Celtic umbrella term. Yeah. How much do we see of the feminine bear? Because in my understanding, it's also a mother figure, right? To be very protective of the young.
Yeah.
Is that something we can claim as Irish? Is it just a general Celtic idea?
Well, when we talk about Celtic stuff, right? Obviously, we're talking about a language group and the literature that they have, and there was some overlap between the two branches, the Brittonic and the Gaelic language branches and stuff like that. But regardless of those two language branches, there's a lot of sharing of symbology. There's a lot of like transposing Gaelic words to be more British sounding in terms of like Welsh sounding or Cornish sounding, and vice versa, and there's movements of people back and forth, and I think that relates pretty well to the mythological cycles and things like that. But I can't speak much for the British side of the Celtic language family because I'm just not all that knowledgeable about it. But that idea of like shape-shifting, people with supernatural abilities to move between worlds, to speak with animals, to travel time and space, and to meet these types of people and the journeys that they take to kind of become new or have more definite form. Like that's a good example of youth going through trials and tribulations to come out on the other side as a hero or as a respected person who might have very humble beginnings. It's like those parallels. Having been raised in the Irish tradition and like seeing songs, in retrospect, I have friends who ask me a lot, like, well, how did you identify with those songs if they were songs talking about, straight people, whatever? And my thing was like, well, so much of Irish language song is ambiguous, and that beauty of being liminal and having like space is something that I think is what makes the language so queer, right? And the stories are the same. Like they're strange, they're fantastical. People move between humans and animals, and goddesses present themselves as young maidens on one hand and destructive crones on the other, and loving mothers, and I hold to that liminality as I mentioned before. It is to me very inspirational, and while it's there in the literature, just because it's not in dictionaries doesn't mean that it doesn't exist and that it doesn't like gel with a lot of understanding. I think a lot of people, especially who are interested in the Irish tradition, Gaelic tradition, are starting to look at some of these ideas. Like today's St. Patrick's Day, and not everyone celebrates St. Patrick's Day, and there are a lot of people who look at St. Patrick as very problematic and very patriarchal. And so who do they turn to? They turn to Bridget, the mother of all, right? And so there's this understanding that people are looking in places that were maybe overlooked or erased just from public memory, and are reclaiming kind of these more strange and fantastical ideas that place Irish identity and thought, especially with that, like kind of outside our Western model that we kind of find ourselves in as speakers of the English language in a really modern world.
When you say in song tradition, there's ambiguity, are people being talked about in the third person, or what is that ambiguity?
So Irish Gaelic song, Irish language song, is it's lyrical in nature rather than narrative, right? And so narratives are like our typical storytelling. I set a mood, I set a place, introduce characters, they go through some sort of trial or tribulation, there's a resolve and a moral, right? So there's this whole arc of telling a story from beginning to end. Irish language song tends to be as if you took a pair of shears and just like clipped that long yarn that was the narrative, and what fell was the song. So it doesn't have a definitive beginning, it doesn't have a definitive end. But what's conveyed through the poetry is the emotion. And so the story itself, the song that's the story that's being presented in song is not necessarily obvious to the listener. But the thing that's most important is the BREE-uhn or scéal in Ruadhán, which is the story, the backstory, which is shared outside of just listening to it. People talk about it, so they remember the people that the song was about. So the retelling of the stories is what's important. It's not the person that's telling the story, right? So what if I'm a male singing about a woman falling in love with a male? Like, that's not. I'm there to tell the story. I'm not there to relate my gender identity, my sexual identity. Now it's great when it intersects, right? And I can feel a little bit of myself going a little deeper into the song. But for me, these songs kind of they're deep wells of emotion, and I find that regardless of who's being talked about and what kind of experiences in the song, like I feel deeply for them because they're the songs of my predecessors, and they're the stories of my predecessors.
Absolutely. One last question from me. Do you see any evidence of queer people being like the holders of tradition in Irish practice, like of music, of storytelling, of language teaching? I mean, I have you as an example, but what about the wider community?
Yes, and yes. You know, as Ireland has always been very progressive in its political agenda, but very socially conservative. And so while, you know, passing the right to, you know, for marriage through referendum, which is a very tricky thing to do, you know, for us in North America, for me, I'll just speak for myself, to put that kind of right to the people could have really backfired. And as a civil right, we expect kind of the highest courts in the land to decide on those things for us. But to put it to the people through referendum was very harrowing, and the outcome was very not unexpected, but it was very heartening to see that it passed with such large margins. But I kind of got lost with that question. What was the question again?
Are queers the holder of tradition?
Yeah. Sorry.
No worries.
So I'm just watching the snow here in Colorado.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah, that's a great way to start off the holiday. Anyhow, yes, there are lots of queer people in the music. And while it hasn't been widely circulated and known from previous generations, it's becoming wider and more widely accepted. Which to me, coming from North America, sometimes we take for granted how much we understand that arts is a vehicle for queerness, for gender ambiguity and strangeness, all the beautiful things that we use art for to express ourselves. And so it is not shocking. It was not shocking to find that there were a lot of queer people who were singers and who were dancers and were playing music. But it was strange to witness, in terms of policy, such like liberal, forward-moving ideas about sexuality and gender regularly being talked about in society, and then experiencing kind of the conservativeness of that as it played out within smaller communities, especially more traditional communities, where things like traditional music, singing, and dancing were huge features of those communities. And so over time, it's become, I think, less of an issue than previously. And in many ways now, like my friend Kira Nihei, who's a great poet who runs Queercal Cora, which is a queer conversational group. They get a lot of flack for making very suggestive and sexual slam poetry through the Irish language, mostly from learners who like to hold down this conservative ideology that the language is meant to represent some like moral superiority or some moral positioning and stuff like that. And it's very strange too what happens with people of color who speak Irish. Ola is one of a good example. Munda Jekko, who's a great radio presenter and has done a lot of work at showcasing other identities of the Irish language from people who don't have white skin and who are not native Irish, who are not native Irish born or whatnot. So the pushback always comes from surprising angles, and it's generally not from native speakers.
I see.
Which points to bigger issues. You've got a subset of community who thinks they're speaking for everyone when they present a really nasty comment or remark about this queer person using the language to talk about their breasts or making out with a same-sex partner or identifying as non-binary, so.
Yeah. Cool. I see there's some questions in the chat, so I might read them to you, or would you like to read them to yourself?
Yeah, what we got here?
I think the first one is from Kit.
Oh yeah,
asking
Kit. Question: pros, cons of Irish borrowing third plural uses a singular usage from English rather than coming up with its own form, or using native forms such as a. That's a good point, and I think we touched a little bit on it. There's definitely a developed nuance between grammatical gender. The term gender is fairly loaded for us in the Western world, and especially here in North America, as it's been the center of a lot of debate and topics for the last several years, for many years. I won't say last several, for many, many years. So bioessentialism, related to genders, is the crux of that argument. When we talk about grammatical gender is not bioessential. I mean, while some, there are terms in Irish, there are words in Irish like style, which means stallion, which is obviously a male horse, but it's a feminine noun, right? And a word like gulna, which is a dress, which is a masculine noun, or Colleen, which is a girl, but is a masculine noun. So when it comes down to like understanding what used to be neutered gender, we really have to tease apart these ideas of bioessentialism, which are the crux of a lot of arguments about identity, and the assumption that someone's body and presentation needs to be commented on or labeled into this or that or that. And understand that gender has been used within the Irish and through teaching as a way to categorize words in and of themselves. So when we talk about the third person a, so we have a, which is the masculine she, e, which is the femme she, in a, which is the gender neutral term, or I wouldn't say gender neutral, I'd say it's neuter term in terms of what kind of typical linguistic terminology, not to be applied to people because that's obviously a little bit of erasure. It's like, referencing someone as it, but in this case, it is used in identifying grammar-based gender. I've asked many people, it just could be that I'm waiting for the right person to come along to ask these questions to about a, and was that ever used within literature to discuss a person rather than neuter gender of a word, this and that. I've never come across that. I think what we have now in terms of using they, coming from our English, borrowing it from the English, as English has used it both as a third person plural and a third person singular to be ambiguous, right? And I tend to try to use it more and more often, just to see, just as my own social experiment, like what happens to the way that I think and interact with people when I stop gendering them all the time with pronouns and start using just a welcoming they, you know?
Yeah.
And some people get confused, you know? But I think over time, that old usage is coming back and we're starting to realize, oh, we don't have to always implement that, you know? However, having said that, like in Irish, you can't say, oh, this is Ruadhán without using a gendered pronoun. So show a Ruadhán, masculine, show I Ruadhán, femme, show iad Ruadhán, third person. So while it's not inextricably linked the way that we kind of think about gender in English, because we don't really have grammatical gender, we have bioessential gender that we reify through generations and generations of using language the same way to identify people in a very specific way. There is that crossover where there are certain aspects of Irish terminology that you have to gender someone, right? And so coming in with shead or iad is important as a, well, here's another option, right? So I see that the pros and cons, the pros is that we have a platform now. We have a step up to identify people who don't necessarily identify as femme or masc, right? The con is that we don't have a native term for it. We don't have a native understanding of that. And we might not have had that understanding in living memory for many, many generations now because of, as Jose had mentioned, you know, so much of our understanding of our language has come through, especially written, was brought in through religious orders that came in. And of course, as they were collecting all this vernacular literature, you know, the stories and songs and poems of the people that were so common during that day, they were erasing things. They were shifting language to represent an ideal Christian understanding of certain things. And that is where we come. That, I believe, is probably the number one reason why we fall short in understanding ourselves beyond the binary, and that it will unfortunately be hidden from us. But so much of our understanding of that language of Irish comes from marginal writings on larger texts, vellum scripts that were written in Latin or in the classical languages. And so it's possible someone wasn't looking closely at a margin when they were talking about a different gender, or someone who was male but cited on feminine presentation, you know, or vice versa, or someone who, you know, it's hard to say and it's hard to know, and that's where we have to be a little brokenhearted. But we at least have this platform. We've got this word to do that work with and to do that work on. So I think that's a good question.
Yeah, thank you, Kit. I think the next question, Courtney shared the link to the dictionary if you guys are interested. But I think the next question is also from Kit about urban usage of words and maybe just borrowing from English.
Yeah, this is a really interesting part and a good question for Kit. So a lot of native Irish speakers would regularly substitute in words that they didn't have in Irish with English. One thing that's really common in Connemara, in Western County Galway, is to use the word weekend, literally weekend. Cathathu yanam er an weekend, you know, as opposed to Cathathu yanam er a derashachtan. What are you doing at the end of the week? So it is fairly common. It maybe gives people rose-colored glasses to think that native speakers in these Irish-speaking regions in the Gaeltacht are fluent, amazing speakers of the language and have like this, you know, such a huge command. It's not true, unfortunately. There are plenty of people living within the Gaeltacht who would use Irish at an every day, but would not have an extensive vocabulary to talk about things like politics, heart surgery, sexuality, gender. And so it's really common for native people to sub in the English language words. And I mean, a lot of us as learners, and I myself was a learner, I did it through immersion, thankfully, but a lot of us, we're like, oh, I don't know that word, so I just put the word in. And I tell my students, just put the word in English, you know. So it is a really common thing to do. But those who are being trained in education, those who've gone to third level education and had through Irish, come out with like a huge command of the language, or had to develop their language skills a lot. And that is an upside to education through the Irish language. And there's also local cultural organizations and cultural centers within these Irish speaking regions that offer workshops so you understand how to work on your laptop and use some of these platforms, but use the Irish language version of those platforms. You know, like, what's the word for download, upload speed, document? What are all these words? They didn't have them. They never used them before. But here within community, they're starting to develop programming to help teach local native speakers more vocabulary, more language based on jargon, so that they can live their lives not having to always reference English.
Yeah, we see that in all different kinds of languages. In my own acquisition of Indonesian, when I don't know, thankfully, most Indonesians have some understanding of English by just throwing an English word in there. Or the example we saw earlier with Samoan masculine female people of using the term tomboy, like from the English, because there is a term in Samoan.
Yeah.
But maybe tomboy has the right feeling the way weekend has the right feeling that maybe is missing for certain words.
Sure. Yeah. And you know, ideas that have kind of long, I think ideas or experiences can, especially when you live in bilingual society, and I mean, Irish is definitely a bilingual society. I've met a few monoglots that had not great English, you know, but by and large, I'd say most native speakers now are working within a bilingual community. And so the back and forth also could very much, their use of certain English language terms could obviously center on their activities around that term that they do in English. What happens is, you know, you might live in an Irish speaking area, but you go to the next town over to the grocery store to get a particular item that you're looking for, or a clothing store, and those people are speaking English, you know, and so you are always coming back forth to that store, and so you have these conversations about things you bought there. English comes naturally because you're having those conversations in English. When I have conversations with people in Irish and I try to recount that in English, I have to stop and say it in Irish and translate my brain, because it just does not. My experience with that person comes through that language, and my other experience here at the grocery store is within English, and so that mixture creates kind of a lot of variability in language use, I find, within the Gaeltacht.
Absolutely. Yeah, and back to this idea of like, what kind of person am I in this language versus another language that I have command of? Am I a similar person? Am I a mix of these two people? Which is a whole neuropsycholinguistic thing that we also don't have time for today, but very prominent thinking, no matter what kind of language we're talking about.
Well, and I think that's a really important case when we talk about what things we do to help and what we hope to preserve when we try to promote language use within designated areas like the Gaeltacht. Like, why is it upsetting to hear Irish spoken within the Gaeltacht? Why is it upsetting to see people getting jobs in shops in the Irish-speaking regions who don't have any Irish at all? It's like, what kind of navigating needs to be done in order to create a balance? Because what we don't want to see is people having less and less ability to talk about their everyday lived experience in Irish, and therefore give Irish up in favor of English, because English is all around them and available to them at all times. As a minority language, this is the biggest issue that we face, is that we have to make a commitment every day to use our language. We have the choice. Our options are not making that choice and being inundated by English and not ever using our language, or being persnickety, being insistent, and correcting people when they call me Brian. Like making the commitment every day, and sometimes to be fairly outspoken about that, and how privileged English is given throughout the world, and as a result of that, our language fails. And when I do things like text editing and like text messaging and stuff, and all my words are being auto-corrected into English, that to me is this like, it's just like it's the tip of the iceberg of what it is to speak a minority language in an English-speaking community.
Absolutely. And I think we can learn as a community, as an Irish community, we can learn a lot from other communities that are actively decolonizing. For example, I was watching TV the other night, and there was a song contest in Hawaiian, and one of the teachers they interviewed would not speak English. Lots of lots of teachers are speaking English because they're like, it's going to be on TV. But this man spoke only in Hawaiian, and he, you know, they had to put the translation on the bottom of the screen, which was extra work for someone, but it's this insistence of like, you are in a space, so you will use this language, or I am in a space and I will use this language. So I think, you know, being in this space and learning from Hawaiian tradition and Hawaiian practices and a reclamation of certain ideas and ideologies, I really think can inform my own journey back or into Irish for myself, but also for the wider community, if we're really serious about the idea of decolonizing or reclaiming land connection,
right,
or any of these bigger ideas.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. You know, a very similar thing happened more recently. There was an Irish news brief about the war in Ukraine, and they did it through Irish, and the amount of vitriol, you know, just like, well, that's not helpful. Helpful to whom?
Right.
You know, like what is your question, and what, you know, and it really pulls out of the woodwork some really, what I find still to be really shocking behavior by Native Irish people who have a disdain and really do believe that it's a waste of time to speak what they consider to be a dead language. It's like they have no concept of the richness and the variety and just the wealth of talent that we have within Irish speaking communities, both in Ireland and outside in diaspora as well, you know.
Cool. One more question in the chat, and then we're a little over time, so maybe this is the last question, unless
someone else has any questions. Ruadhán in DC asked, they said that my explanation of the etymology of hAirt was really helpful. Could you also break down the roots and routes of terms like atoch, nyav, nyehurhe, and are there any terms that you especially like or don't like? So the dictionary is called Unfolklore atoch. Atoch means queer. The root of that is at, which means strange. So it is kind of rooted in the same concept as English. And that is problematic. You know, are we saying that regardless of your language, the experience of being strange, is it always going to be rooted in terminology that has to be reclaimed as being positive, you know? And it's the same for éireach. Air is the Irish word for air. Éireach, kind of air, gaily, right? Some of the other ones like nyav, yenarha. I have to look that one. Nyav is kind of to mean non or negative, to mean like not there at all. Sorry, I'm just looking in the dictionary to see which one. Yeah, so the non-binary de. Déanarthacht inchkna would be the gender binary. So nyav, nyarhanacht, nyarharacht would be non-binary, right? De sometimes can be like nyev or negative. So I think the root of that one is maybe a little bit more literal, but from the Irish side of things. There's not really any term I dislike. Some of them that are very, very literal, I think, are just a little not creative. One of the beauties about the Irish language is how creative it can be in the creation of terminology. You know, Ruadhán had mentioned the two-spirit being in this dictionary. I'm not of any sound mind that it was included as an identity for Irish speakers in Ireland, but maybe just as an ability to talk about two-spirited people. But I thought that was pretty. There's a literal version, da animul, which is two spirits of spirit, right? Or then you will ra spirit an unte, a person with two spirits in them. so which is quite literal. And lacks any sort of creativity, but regardless, they're still great terms. I mean, I can't complain that we have these terms at all. The fact that we have them is a step forward, and I think it's really important.
Absolutely. Jose, maybe you could have people come off mute to give them one last chance to ask a question if they feel the need.
All set. If anyone
All
else?
right.
No one.
We have all the questions answered. Any last call here for questions if you want to come off or type in the chat, that's still available.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that we just didn't have time for, but you had mentioned is like indigenous language and connection to land and landscape, and that's one thing we talked a little bit about last night, Ruadhán, when we were kind of doing this leading up to today, is how much indigenous knowledge is tied up in our place names on the island, and that island's gone through an ecocide, a loss of its forest. I mean, the island of Ireland was mostly forested up to about 80% and is now only 3% forested. And that huge shift environmentally, the impact that could have had on, or seems to have had on, indigenous language around land use. And then we talk about modernity and like no longer living the ways that our predecessors were living. And so we're losing aspects of that language. Is that a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Is it a sign of progress? Is it's neither here nor there, you know? And the work of Menkon Mengon, who's been doing a lot to pull these older words out, has done some really great work. However, I've always kind of questioned the validity of reclaiming words that we no longer have a lifestyle to accommodate. And is this just the natural progress of language? Do we shed old skin in favor of new skin? And I think we're at a crossroads where we're recognizing what we've lost, we're recognizing the things that we still need to reclaim, and we're kind of looking forward with making sure that Irish is a language that we can use to identify ourselves in the world. And I think that's it's progress when we can sit down and have a conversation about this and pull up a queer dictionary with people outside of Ireland in diaspora to have these conversations. So I'm really grateful that you helped organize this, Jose as well, and the Matsunaga Institute for Peace for doing this. And I really appreciate everyone showing up. I see a lot of people I recognize here. So thank you for spending your St. Patrick's Day with us.
Yeah, thanks for coming, BREE-uhn. Thanks everybody else for tuning in and learning along with me about Irish identity.
Thank you so much, Ruadhán and BREE-uhn, for just a very deep dive into the language. And I really appreciate, I mean, I definitely came out of this with a lot of more kernels of knowledge. I know I'm going to have to rewatch it again just and go to some of those links that were provided. Thank you so much for everything you did today, for reminding us about the importance of really just kind of not forgetting our origins, our ancestral indigenuity. I think it's so important as we move forward. We always say, you know, it's important to know the past, to not repeat it. And many times we kind of tend to forget about the indigenous aspect of that. And so thank you for that. And it's always amazing for me to see how much guidance there is if we actually go back to it, and it kind of almost like lights a pathway into what we may think is like a new way that we're going into nowadays. So and I yeah, so thank you for allowing us to be a guest within your homes today and continuing to uplift voices. And last but not least, thank you to everyone for joining today's talk story. We deeply appreciate your interest and support in sitting down at our table to learn about Indigenous nations near and far for a cultural talk story. Thanks again, everyone.